Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second Australasian Adventures webinar. For those of you in Europe, thank you for joining us at this hour of the morning. We have people from all over the world on today, so whatever time of the day it is with you, thank you for joining us. We are aiming to keep the webinar to 45 minutes, and we will have time for questions and answers at the end of the event. You can ask questions via Q&A, the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom window. To start proceedings, my colleague Ben Lepke will give a market update on the current position in Australia and New Zealand and the trends we are seeing. Ben will be followed then by Maroon Elias from our migration partners Ernst & Young. Maroon will provide an update on the current immigration, quarantine and flight capacity limits in place at present. We look forward to the potential framework plan for 2021 as well. Now, I'll pass over to my colleague Ben, who will start proceedings.
Thank you very much, Peter. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you all for being here. As Peter mentioned, this is the second of our Australasian Adventure webinars. Therefore, I will still apologise for any small slip-ups that may occur throughout these proceedings. I'm speaking to you here from our Sydney-based office, which is a nice balmy spring afternoon here, as you can see behind me. Briefly, a bit about myself. I've now had upwards of 12 years experience in medical recruitment, assisting doctors locate permanent and locum opportunities around both Australia and New Zealand. Over these years, I've assisted upwards of 100 doctors move to Australia from across the globe through varying pathways and all different levels of experience. In addition to the permanent placements, we run a busy locum team rotating doctors around the country, which is something I hope to help you with once you're eligible to do so and over this side of the world. Before we move on, I'd like to give a quick high-level update on the pandemic across Australasia. Both Australia and New Zealand have handled the outbreak very well. Victoria, who have recently had a strong second wave, which started around 2 months ago, have now brought that under control. A number of states and territories have been recording zero community transfers for months at a time. New Zealand has seen extremely low numbers throughout the last 6 months, is essentially operating as a normal country would do, aside from the international travel. This means that Australia and New Zealand are very much open in terms of relocating to this side of the world for the right people, and namely doctors like yourselves. Currently, there are exemptions in place for medical practitioners to enter both countries with varying requirements for quarantine, which Maroon from Ernst & Young will discuss in more detail later in the webinar. So now for an update on the job market here. There's continual demand for overseas trained doctors to work across Australia and New Zealand. This demand is increasing due to the COVID pandemic happening globally, mainly due to the reduction in overseas trained doctors arriving over on this side of the world. Australia and New Zealand have a strong reliance on overseas trained doctors. However, this year has seen the usual numbers not arrive for a variety of reasons. Reasons driving this: media reports driving incorrect perceptions of the actual situation across both countries, incorrect advice being given due to a gap in knowledge of some of the recruitment consultants, hospital staff and migration agents. And this also leads to an uncertainty in the true situation and positions available for doctors with the right experience. The official stance is actually quite positive. Exemptions are in place for doctors to secure visas and are eligible for entry into both countries. With the increased demand, there are plenty of opportunities across Australasia. Aeroplanes are still flying to both Australia and New Zealand from most large international airports with connections to both countries. The medical boards are actually improving efficiencies, including online application submission and processing as opposed to postal. So moving on, I'd like to discuss the benefits of working in regional areas as opposed to metro. These points are derived from discussions with doctors who have relocated to Australia over the years. To be clear, we do have metropolitan opportunities available, which will be similar to what you are familiar with for those from the UK and Ireland, such as Dublin, Belfast, London, Manchester, etc. What we tend to find is doctors would like to know more information about the regional positions, as this is the area they are not quite familiar with. Regional hospitals provide greater clinical exposure, which can accelerate your career. This does not mean you'll be required to work excessive hours, as fatigue is closely monitored and departments are well supported over on this side of the world. Total remuneration packages tend to be higher due to location loadings. These packages can also include accommodation, relocation allowances, professional development allowances, and various other add-ons that can be negotiated at the point of contract. Regional hospitals are more open to assist with your specific needs, including permanent residency applications and future training positions that will be available. Hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea on the benefits of working regionally across both countries. We feel and have been told that it gives you the chance to experience the real Australia and New Zealand adventures. When moving to Australia, we require doctors to be a minimum of PGY2, so postgraduate year 2 and upwards. Essentially, 1 year's experience, which will be a completion of your FY1 year or internship from the UK and Ireland. If you are coming from a country, if you're coming via a country outside of the UK and Ireland, there are varying requirements for registration, which we can discuss following this webinar. To be clear, we can help most doctors make the move to this side of the world, as long as there is some degree of flexibility with your first position. We assess each doctor on their individual needs and wants to ensure you find a post that is of interest to you. Positions are available across most specialisms. However, we do find that accident and emergency and general medicine, with its subspecialties, is a main area of need across Australia. A critical care year can be a mixture of A&E, ICU, and some anaesthetics in certain locations. This is generally organised when you arrive into Australia or New Zealand. This is not your main area of interest. You can take a sidestep for a year and work in these areas before moving into your preferred specialty at a later date. We find that New Zealand has a greater breadth of available specialties. Therefore, should you be set on a specific area of medicine, there is a good chance we will be able to locate this for you in New Zealand. Outside of the normal settings, we do also have opportunities available in retrieval medicine based out of iconic places such as Alice Springs, the Red Centre of Australia. Retrieval is the only option in Australia which entertains a 6-month contract. Please let us know if this is a type of position that would be of interest to you, and we can discuss this in more detail following. So moving on, I'd like to give you an overview on Australia. Australia is a very large and diverse country, especially when it comes to climate and geography. Something that you should bear in mind when deciding where you would like to be based. The climate varies from hot and tropical to snowy mountains and everything in between. Although famous for extremes, many people don't realise the other benefits to the weather down under, such as mild winters, warm springs and autumns, and in fact, many people don't know you can actually go skiing here. We work across all 8 states and territories, and both islands of New Zealand. It will take too long to discuss all, but we'll give you a brief overview of some of the options below. Starting at the bottom and going clockwise, we have South Australia. With opportunities in Metro Adelaide available, as well as regional towns. SA is known for many things, including its wine regions, its opal mining, and its cage shark diving. Moving west to Western Australia, and the picture of a place where we regularly work with current need is called Busselton. Just south of Perth and 1 hour from the beautiful Margaret River wine region, we have a doctors relocated here specifically for the surfing options along the coastline. As we move north of the WA coast, we have opportunities in places like the famous Broome and Kimberley region. This is where it definitely starts to be classed as the outback. Skipping then over to Northern Territory, housing famous places such as Alice Springs, Uluru and Darwin. The picture you can see above there is a sunset over Darwin's coastline. Heading east in Queensland, we work with the entire Queensland coast, which is a more populated state with many more towns. You can be based on the Queensland coast in places such as Cairns, with easy access to the Great Barrier Reef, which runs for half the length of the state. Should you wish to be closer to Brisbane, opportunities are available in southeast Queensland. New South Wales, which is where I'm based, is a large state with a higher population level, meaning there are many towns, both coastal and inland. We can secure work opportunities in the Greater Sydney area should this be of your choice. ACT, home to Canberra, the capital of Australia, is an inland city situated close to the snowy mountains of New South Wales. Several years ago, we relocated a group of 15 friends across from Ireland together to work in the Canberra hospital for a period of 12 months. Victoria is similar to New South Wales in terms of the population and options in terms of regional towns. Metro Melbourne is very competitive, but not impossible for the right doctor who is flexible. Victoria has some amazing ski fields and wine regions as well. And finally, not to be forgotten, we have the island of Tasmania, a beautiful island that the locals like to keep secret for themselves. You'll find it looks and feels very much like parts of Ireland in the UK. Hobart is famous for its whiskey, cheese, and of course, the end of the Sydney-Hobart race. Now to quell some common concerns. Regional doesn't mean outback, and often you will be in a town or small city ranging population up to 400,000 people. Junior doctors do not tend to be employed to work in remote settings and certainly not alone. These towns often have good infrastructure, nice restaurants, pubs, strong internet, and many of them are often near or part of the tourist trail. Airports are in most towns across Australia. People do use planes more like buses here, meaning you can easily get to the rest of the country during your time off if you are in one of the regional locations. Now, an overview on New Zealand. New Zealand consists of 20 regions across 2 islands, the north and the south, of which all have a requirement for doctors. Like Australia, New Zealand is more competitive in main cities such as Auckland. However, there are many opportunities in cities and towns available. Both islands are mountainous with ski fields in the winter season. The South Island is where you will find famous places like Queenstown, the home of extreme sports, where you can throw yourself off several bridges and take a jet boat down a river. Climate-wise, New Zealand is a colder country than Australia. However, there are still some warm summers to be had in certain places, especially at the north end of the North Island. There are some routes of entry for doctors that are not available for Australia that are in New Zealand, including fast track for senior doctors wishing to engage in locum work. Another benefit to New Zealand and Australia alike is that citizenship of one allows you to work and live across both countries. Most specialist colleges in Australia are Australasian, meaning gaining fellowship in either country will be recognised reciprocally in other. Therefore, you can become dual citizens and recognised as a specialist in both countries. We will draw a close to talking about Australia and New Zealand in general terms, as we could go on for forever. We will provide more detail when we have our personal conversations following this webinar. So now moving on to working in Australia and New Zealand. Entry to Australia and New Zealand are similar processes. For ease of this conversation, I'm going to focus on the process into Australia. Detailed conversations can be had with you afterwards regarding your specifics, and if New Zealand, it is very much the same process. It's a straightforward 3-step process for non-specialists. The AMC stands for the Australian Medical Council, the Medical Board, and then immigration. First part of the process is the Australian Medical Council. Their purpose through this process is to check the validity of your medical degree. This is done by completing an online application, which can take around 6 weeks. We advise that people commence this application as soon as possible, as it can be done at any time. APRA, which stands for the Australian Health Practitioners Regulation Agency, also known as the Medical Board, are here to check that your skills and experience are of the level required for the position we have locked in for you. APRA provides you with your registration to practice in Australia. Immigration is the third part of this process and will be discussed by my colleague Maroon after this slide. To give you an overview on documentation required, we will need CV in APRA format, which will be signed by yourself and dated, referee contacts, your degree, criminal checks from all countries you've lived in within the last 10 years, certificates of good standing from all country medical boards that you've been registered to work in within the last 10 years, your passport, if from the UK and Ireland coming through the competent authority pathway, your FY1 letter stating completion of supervised practice, and any other supporting documents depending on the pathway that you may be coming through, whether that might be an IELTS, PLAB exam, USMLE, LMCC, etc., etc., etc. Costs associated with the application for a non-specialist. The AMC has a fee of 500 Australian dollars. APRA has two fees of $393, which comprise of an initial application and your 1-year registration, totaling $786. There will be the requirements and notarized documents. Therefore, there will be a cost when going to a notary public or justice of the peace. Postage costs where required. However, as mentioned before, the online applications are now negating the need for postage, so that shouldn't be required at this point in time. And Maroon from Ernst & Young will discuss costs associated with the visa next. With regards to specialists, there is a college application that needs to be completed in part of this application process, and I can come on to that in more detail following this webinar. Application times for non-specialists are 4 to 6 months in total, and the processing time does depend heavily on how quickly you can gather your documentation together.
Thank you, Ben. We'll now pass on to Maroon Elias from Ernst & Young. Maroon will take us through the current picture in regard to immigration and quarantine procedures and also what we can look forward to in 2021. Maroon.
Thanks, Peter, and thank you all for joining us today. I will be providing some insight into the current immigration climate in Australia and how this will potentially impact your journey down under. I will focus on the initial temporary visa pathway that you will require to enter into Australia, and we'll cover on some of the travel and quarantine restrictions that are currently in effect. And then I'll finish up with a brief discussion on the pathways to becoming a permanent resident in Australia. As you would be aware, there have been some significant changes in immigration regulations and policies since the outbreak of COVID. These changes have restricted the entry of foreign nationals into Australia. However, the Australian government has paved a particular path to ensure medical practitioners can enter and reside in Australia. As foreign medical practitioners, you are eligible to still apply for the temporary skill shortage subclass 482 visa. This is the main working visa for temporary residents to come and enter into Australia to work. It is an employer-sponsored visa, which means that you can only obtain this visa through being sponsored by an Australian business. The Australian government has issued most recently a list of priority occupations which have been flagged as occupations that can still obtain this visa during the COVID pandemic. And out of 17 of those occupations, the majority of them relate to medical practitioners that have been listed on that priority list. This effectively means that although the Australian government has technically closed the Australian border for medical practitioners, the Australian government will still facilitate your visa application and provide a pathway for you to enter and live in Australia. Due to the border closures, there is an additional requirement in addition to obtaining the Australian visa. As foreigners, you will be required to apply for a travel exemption to enter Australia. It does remain within the discretion of the Australian Border Force to determine if a travel exemption will be granted on a case-by-case basis. We've worked with a number of foreign medical practitioners in obtaining these exemptions. The threshold for granting or obtaining these exemptions are relatively high, and then definitely not automatically granted. We will work with you to collate a submission and make an application to the Australian Border Force for your travel exemption. Upon the Australian government granting you the travel exemption, you can progress with entering into Australia. There is a requirement for all travellers, including Australian and foreign nationals, to quarantine in a government-arranged hotel for 14 days upon arrival into Australia. The policy associated with the quarantine is based on the particular state or territory that you are entering Australia into. and some costs will most likely be imposed on travellers to pay for the costs associated with the accommodation for the quarantine period. You can discuss these arrangements with One Medical, and in some instances, the health facility that you're going to be working with, and they will be able to advise you on what contribution they will make towards the costs associated with that quarantine bill. In addition to the visa application and the travel/quarantine requirements, the only other factor that you would need to consider is logistically finding a flight into Australia. The good news is that the Australian government has recently increased their cap of international arrivals from 4,000 to 6,000 people entering Australia. This cap is continuously being revised, and we expect that it will most likely double within the next 6 months. From a costing perspective, I did mention earlier that there are costs associated with the quarantine. In addition to that, there are costs associated with your visa application. Some of these costs are met by either One Medical or the health facility that you'll be working at. This includes the costs associated with your sponsorship and the training levy, which is payable to the Australian government in support of your application. The cost incurred by you will be limited to the visa lodgement charge and any ancillary costs associated with obtaining the visa. Just to give you an idea, the current visa lodgement charges is approximately $2,500 for an adult and approximately $650 for a child. To wrap up my talk, I will give you an overview now on the pathways to permanent residency, which will permit you to live permanently into Australia and subsequently transition to Australian citizenship if that's what you prefer. As medical practitioners, there are many options for you to obtain permanent residency in Australia. These options aren't readily available to all occupations or even to most occupations. However, as medical practitioners, there is a strong need and demand in Australia, and the government has included most occupations associated with medical practitioners on the list of occupations that are approved for this pathway. You can either apply for permanent residency independently as an independent applicant, or you can be sponsored by an Australian employer. That includes One Medical or the health facility that you may potentially be working at on a more permanent basis. The requirements for permanent residency will depend on your individual circumstances. Our recommendation is to reach out to us upon first settling into Australia and discussing with us your options if you do foresee this as a plan in the future. We will arrange a briefing with you where we can discuss the options that are available to you, as well as the steps that you need to take upon commencing employment in Australia to ensure that you can secure that pathway to permanent residency. I do emphasize this. It is vital that you understand the pathways and the requirements for applying to permanent residency as soon as you do commence working in Australia, as this will ensure that you are applying for and accepting appropriate placements that do not jeopardize your ability to apply for permanent residency. I will revert now back to Ben to continue his presentation. If you do have any immigration questions, send them through and we will address them at the end of this session. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you ever so much, Maroon. His contact details will be available at the end of the presentation along with all of us. And just before I move on to the next slide, I did want to give a bit of positive news and a real life current example. Is that of 4 doctors offered contracts with the Royal Darwin Hospital earlier this year, around June or July. And 2 of them have already landed on the ground in Australia and already in quarantine, and the others are closely following. So their processes have taken between 3 to 5 months from point of application to the AMC and APRA. There is varying time frames with the immigration department at the moment, and that is the difference between the 3 to 5 months. But it's very positive to see doctors actually arriving here in Australia on a regular basis. So now I'm going to come on to the fun part, locuming across Australia and New Zealand. It's common that Irish, UK and foreign trained doctors engage in locum work following their first year of work while they wait to decide their next steps in their career. Depending on your entry to Australia, you generally have to complete 12 months of full-time supervised practice to gain your general registration with APRA, which will then allow you to locum. A visa is required for locum work, and One Medical are able to provide you with a 482 skilled work visa for a period of up to 4 years, allowing you to freely move around Australia, completing locums in various locations. Many locum positions are in regional locations, so doctors tend to base themselves in a metro area and do fly-in, fly-out via an airport. This gives a great work-life balance, high income options, and the ability to be based in any of the main cities such as Melbourne, Sydney, Adelaide, etc., or even Auckland, Queenstown. Alternatively, some doctors decide to pack up their life into a van or 4x4 with a tent on the top, decide on a plan of where they would like to go to in conjunction with myself, advising where locum work will be, and they set off on 1 to 2 years living and working while on the move. This is a superb way to see all of Australia and or New Zealand while making a decent amount of money along the way. Locum rates you can expect to earn. Juniors are paid between $100 to $120 an hour in Australian dollars. Middle grade, you're talking 120 to 160 an hour. Staff grade, 160 up to 300. We book all flights and cars for you if required. Hospitals generally provide accommodation either on site or close to the hospital, and this is all paid for by the hospital with no cost to you. Locum work is a great way to take a breather, earn some great money, and decide your next steps in your career. So I'd like to go through a 3-year journey. As we are coming to the end of our webinar, I wanted to finish off on 2 examples of 3-year journeys that we've had. Firstly, you make your move to Australia or New Zealand. You work in a full-time role for 12 to 18 months, gaining your general registration. You complete 1 to 2 years worth of locum work around either country. Many doctors move to secure residency and sometimes citizenship during this period. Then you make the decision as to whether you would like to repatriate or to continue on this side of the world and enter into a training scheme, both of which we can help with. To give you 2 examples, Renee and Steph, both of them moved also to Darwin and worked in their ED for 1.5 years. They bought a 4x4 Land Cruiser and are currently traveling around Australia. Initially, they drove to Alice Springs from Darwin to see Uluru. They drove northeast up through the central Queensland to Cairns and then down to their first locum in central Queensland, where they have been for a number of months. Renee and Steph plan to travel down the New South Wales coast soon for a 2-month locum, and then they'll be driving over to WA, where they will be completing a 6-month fixed-term accredited position with the Australian College of Emergency Medicine. Then continuing their trip up the WA coast to do locum work for a further 6 months, before then settling in one of the locations where they visited on this trip. The second, Matthew and Aoife, they moved to Melbourne and work in an outer metro hospital for 1.5 years. Following this, they then moved to central Melbourne, where they based themselves and travelled to and from a couple of hospitals, completing 1 to 2 week locums at a time around regional Victoria. Their mission was to save as much money as possible, live a city lifestyle, and return to Ireland for training, which they did exactly this. I believe they're both now settled in their training schemes and return to Ireland fairly comfortable from a financial perspective. So we can help you recreate either of these adventures if this is something of interest. So that brings us to a conclusion of my part, and I'll hand back to my colleague in Ireland, Peter Healy. Thank you again all for your time, and I look forward to speaking with you all individually about your situation and how you would like your adventure to unfold. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben. Now we will open the webinar to questions. You can ask questions or type them out in the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and we'll be here for the next 15 minutes to answer any questions you may have. I have a question already from Dr. Parikh, who's based in the US. and is a nephrologist, and was asking whether you would have to come through the general medicine pathway, the general medicine specialist pathway, to work as a nephrologist. Now, it's specialist pathway is quite complicated, so we'll probably come back to Dr. Parikh offline. But Ben, did you just want to come in on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been working with someone else in sort of your position, but in a different college, who's going through the residency at the moment in the US. Essentially, if you do complete your residency and gain your equivalent of a fellowship in the US of A, you are eligible to apply through the specialist pathway and through the college over here in Australia. The way that the colleges work is they do an assessment on your application, your training, where you graduated and did your internship from, and then they also do quite a structured clinical interview. Depending on how all of those go, they will give you an outcome, one of 3 options. One of them will be sort of substantially comparable, partially comparable, or non-comparable. If you come through the US, I would expect substantially or partially. And with these, this will then give you an outline of what further training you may have to do, and or what further examinations you would need to do. Should you get one of those 2, it gives you the ability to come across and work in Australia. But we won't know exactly where you can work until you do that application. So that's a general overview on your situation there. But I would definitely like to take that offline and see if we will be able to help you with that experience move to Australia or New Zealand, definitely.
Yeah, we'll certainly come back to Dr. Parikh offline in regard to that. I have another question here from Aoife. It's New Zealand specific, but I think it's a good question because it's applicable to both countries. Essentially, is New Zealand open to families too, or the exemptions just made for doctors, as in the immigration procedures? Are they open to just the doctor as an individual applicant, or do the families come along as well? Maroon, do you want to answer that for Australia first off?
Sure. So I can cover it for Australia and New Zealand if you'd like. So from an Australian perspective, there is the requirement to lodge a travel exemption, and that travel exemption will be based on the doctor's critical skills. As part of that, where the doctor is granted that travel exemption, all of their family members that are included as part of their application will be also granted a travel exemption to enter into Australia. New Zealand is relatively similar. There's potentially a bit more discretion given to the assessing officers when they're looking at those exemption requests, whether they're going to accept family members. But I'd say that the default position will be that they will most likely also allow the family members to also enter into New Zealand, where they accept the travel exemption for the doctor.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much, Maroon. We have a question here from Mike. Ben, you'd be in a position to answer this. He just wants to clarify in terms of locum work in Australia. Do you need to be signed off after 1 year? He's a 1 year postgraduate. He's wondering, is 1 year postgraduate in any country sufficient, or to locum in Australia?
Unfortunately not. In Australia, it needs to be the 1 year of experience here in Australia. So you would turn up, do 12 months worth of supervised practice, which is the job you would get. Following that, during that period, you'll be on provisional registration for the 12 months. You then put an application into APRA. Following the completion of that, probably work an extra month, get your general registration, and then you're able to locum for as long as you see fit. At the level that you're capable of working at, and that's definitely something we do that with a lot of doctors. I've currently got 11 doctors on a visa for us currently locuming around the country who have made that move. So that's definitely something we can help with, but unfortunately you will have to do that first year in supervised practice.
Yeah,
not locum.
Yeah, unfortunately, locum isn't available until after 12 months. Mike is a 1 year postgraduate in the UK. He's just doing his foundation year training. So I suppose to just clarify, under what's called the competency authority pathway, if you've done your intern year in Ireland or your FY year in the UK, it allows you to register under the competent authority pathway, but you still need to do 12 months supervised practice, don't you?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. I have another question here from another doctor. He's got his RACP assessment from the specialist peer review. He's applying for jobs, but it's not working. Are there any other ways to get jobs? He's a neurologist. Or she.
I have to admit that's quite a broad question, Firaz. I would much rather discuss that with you directly following this. I'd need to understand what the peer review said, the outcome, and what the requirements are for you to work in. Neurology is a fairly competitive market over here as well, to be open and honest. But if you can send that through to me following, we can have a conversation about it and maybe look at potential options across New Zealand as well if Australia isn't working.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Ben. Another question on the specialist pathway from the perspective of somebody coming to Australia under specialist pathway as a psychiatrist. Would opting for an area of need pathway be helpful? And is that option available? And what are the advantages and disadvantages of applying through an area of need pathway?
Yeah. Okay, cool. So most colleges allow for a dual application through, which is the specialist pathway or an area of need. Now, sometimes it's slightly difficult because you do need to state this at the beginning, whether you want to be dual assessed. You can't do it post. So we generally say that people should do that. The difficulty comes is that you need to have an area of need application or job to do the application. When I say difficulty, it means you need to be willing to go and do that. It is easier to find an area of need position because these are based generally in more regional and remote areas of Australia. When I say remote, I'll say it loosely with you being psychiatry. Psychiatry departments are mainly situated in larger hospitals anyway. VMOs will fly in and out of the much smaller towns. So you're going to be in a relative sized town. We have a mental health team here who specialise in bringing over doctors in your situation. We've got a few going through the process at the moment. I suppose to answer your question as regards to advantages, disadvantages, if you go to area of need, the hospital may not be able to provide the further training requirements that you need to gain fellowship, but it will allow you access into Australia. So what that means is that you can get into Australia, you may have to do X amount of training, but you can come here, work, get Australian experience, and then move to a hospital that allows you to do that training. That's the negative. The positive is obvious. I mean, if you get the job and you go through the A&E pathway and you're granted the ability to work as a specialist there, you can come to Australia. So people see that as a good stepping stone of getting into Australia. Yes, it does delay the process, but it's a very good way of getting here quicker. And I'd very much like to take that offline and discuss that with you, Deepak, because my colleague, who's also called Ben, the manager of our mental health team, will definitely be able to help with that.
Great, thank you very much, Ben. And just going back to Firaz, who asked the question earlier about the RACP specialist assessment, he's also asked about, in terms of his wife, she's a general practitioner, and what advice would be the best way for her to apply. But we'll probably go back to Firaz offline because there's quite a few questions that'll take quite a bit of time to answer there. Do you have any quick comment on that?
When we speak, Firaz, please, if we can see her CV, see what her qualifications are, where she's acquired the general practitioner fellowship, if there is one, through, and then we can take it from there. The RACGP College has got quite a few pathways through it, and they have a number of international medical graduate assessment processes that we can look at for you. So that's something we can talk about following this, definitely.
Okay, thanks, Ben. I have a question here from Sunita. This one for you, Maroon. She's an IMG awaiting her work visa. She's general medicine specialist and she's already secured a position in Sydney. Now, how long would we expect the visa process to take? Because she applied in June and it still hasn't come through.
Sure. So the Australian government has put a hold on most visas that are being lodged for people that are currently outside of Australia. So to trigger the department to progress with processing your application, the recommendation is to look at lodging a travel exemption on the basis of your critical skills. Once that's assessed by the Australian Border Force, that will trigger the Department of Home Affairs to look at your application and process it. I will caveat that, and it's most vital for you to ensure that you have provided all the information and documents to support your visa application. Otherwise, the Department of Home Affairs will not be in a position to make a decision on your application. In any case, feel free to reach out to me and we can look at your application further and explore the opportunity of applying for that travel exemption so you can get into Australia and your visa can be processed.
Thanks, Maroon. Just a quick question back to you again, Maroon, from Aoife in regard to New Zealand. Is the application process the same as pre-COVID? Do you still need to apply for an essential jobs skills visa, or is there a separate type of process now because of COVID?
So it is the same legislative framework. However, when it comes to their policy and practice of processing applications, it has changed slightly. For medical practitioners, it's changed significantly for non-medical practitioners trying to get a visa into New Zealand.
Great, thanks, Maroon. Ben, one last question for you. We have Janeet here, who's a resident medical officer in anaesthesia from Sri Lanka. More than 5 years postgraduate experience, has AMC Part 1 and all the IELTS bands over 7. Was wondering what the perspectives are on securing a job in Australia and New Zealand.
Australia is going to be difficult, especially in anaesthetics. New Zealand, I would potentially suggest that it would be difficult in anaesthetics as well. I would suggest that you may have to sidestep, as we discussed before, into another specialty or area. My advice for doctors with your experience is applying to the RMO campaigns that are available across Australia and also New Zealand. And look, if you would like to pop me an email through following this to the Ben@One Medical, for anyone who's listening with your situation, please do, which is on the screen in front of you. I'll quite happily send you through links to the RMO campaigns so you can get your name in there. It's very difficult for us to help doctors through the MCQ pathway currently without any work experience in UK, Ireland, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, unfortunately. But I'm more than happy to direct you in the right direction. Hopefully assist you in getting a job, or explain how you can do that yourself, and then we can help you down the line. That's something we're more than happy to do.
Thank you, Ben. Sorry, I thought that was the last question, but just one last one. It's quite short. Ben, this will be for you. What's the shortest time frame to get from Ireland to Australia as a non-specialist doctor?
The quickest we can get people here is 3 months. With the visa happening at the moment, you know, you're looking more like applications for AMC APRA. We could get that done in 3 months. Your visa is then either fairly quick or takes quite a while. It's varying a lot at the moment. So quickest 3 months, usual is about 5 months. 5 months is generally the standard of getting people here. If you've got a difficult application or mistakes have happened, then unfortunately that does delay it by 2 to 6 weeks at a time, depending on how long it takes to get that piece of documentation through.
And sorry, Ben, can I just add to that? From a COVID perspective, what we're seeing across the industry, across a range of clients, is that initially when the COVID outbreak initiated or started, a lot of people put a lot of their plans on hold. Now, as we're evolving and progressing, we realize that it's probably going to be a longer stretch of this pandemic environment than what we originally thought. And a lot of people have started to move on with it and have started making plans to move forward with life in this current environment and deal with the particular obstacles. So From the perspective of going through the process of getting your appropriate registration and so on and so forth, it's probably ample time to do that now, which will put you in a position in about 2 or 3 months' time to commence that visa application process, because what the framework and border controls will look like in 3 months' time will most likely be significantly different from an Australian perspective to what it looks like now.
I will just follow up with that as well on a little piece of it. To speed up the process, the AMC application, which is actually called the EPIC, can be done at any point. So if you're keen on coming to Australia, my advice to everyone, which I can, again, if you email me, I can send you the applications. You do that now. The process takes 4 to 6 weeks and it does not expire. Therefore, if you get that out of the way now, when you actually come to move to Australia, you've already done 4 to 6 weeks length of process. So we advise everyone to do that application as soon as possible, which again, I can send links out following this for you.
Great. Thank you very much, Ben and Maroon. That's the end of the questions and answers session. We'll get back to anybody who's asked a question offline, because some of the questions, particularly in regard to the specialist pathway, can be quite complicated and would require a lot more depth than the time we have at the moment. But we'll get back to each person individually. If you have any questions that you didn't get to ask here, please feel free to reach out to Ben, Maroon, or myself. I'm based in Ireland, so I'm on the time zone here for Europe. So I'll be free to answer any questions at any time during the day in Europe. So thank you, Ben, and thank you, Maroon, for the presentation today. And that pretty much concludes the webinar. And we look forward to hearing from you again at some point in the future.
No worries. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for taking your time. I hope to hear from as many of you as possible. Have a great day. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Cheers,
Maroon.
everyone.
Bye, Peter.